Well, Robert Locke here. Thanks for hanging out with us today. We're going through some myths of property management, things that are kind of on the surface property managers to believe to be true, but once you tease it out a little bit, you find out maybe it's not. The one we're talking about today is myth number 2, and it goes something like this. A professional manager must apply their qualifying guidelines to every applicant the same way every time. And really, most people, if you've gone to a class recently, our knee-jerk would say, of course that is the right statement, that everybody needs to be treated the same way. Now, the challenge is this. We know that we must have qualifying standards. They must be in writing. They must be used objectively. They must be applied across the board to people. They're called qualifying guidelines, and we must apply them consistently to all applicants. But that's only partly true. The real question is this: can you have multiple qualifying guidelines? Can you have a set of guidelines for this group of houses and a different set of guidelines for this group of houses? Most of you are sitting there thinking, no, you can't do that. And most of you are, because most of you have already 2 categories of applicants. You have your standalone properties, then you have your Section 8 or government subsidized properties. So you already have 2 sets of guidelines if you're managing both of those books of business. But the question is, who should establish and who should define them? Now we're going to take a couple of minutes and we're going to unpack this, and we're going to kind of see where this goes, because what is kind of believed by most people on the surface and the kind of accepted carte blanche, when you pick it apart, not quite as true as you might think. Don't go anywhere. We need 5 seconds. Hang on. Okay, well, thanks for hanging out with us and coming back. We're dealing today with a question that goes something like this. Can you have different qualifying guidelines for different slices of your business? And the answer really is yes, but it's different than what most people have heard. So let's tease this out a little bit, and I'll bring you along. First of all, you've got kind of a normal market. For Atlanta, for our market, North Atlanta, kind of the $1,300 a month single family home model. The thing we found, though, is that we took on a $900 a month house down inside the perimeter, maybe down in some rough areas of town. We didn't apply the same standards, the same qualifying guidelines for somebody renting for $1,350 out in the suburbs versus somebody for $900 down inside the city. Now you might say, boy, there's something wrong with that. I understand. I've felt that struggle with that for years. But keep going with us and you'll see where I'm headed. Many people do subsidized housing along with their regular market. Well, without realizing it, you already have 2 sets of guidelines, don't you? You have one where you're verifying income, verifying employment. You're using a 3 times income to rent ratio, or 3 times rent to income ratio. You're looking at employment history and rental history, and you're scrutinizing them pretty thoroughly. When you do subsidized housing, you eliminate a lot of those categories. So you really already have 2 sets, but you can actually have more than 2 sets. Depending on your market and where you are, you could say, I've got a set of guidelines when rent is under a certain dollar amount. You're not discriminating. You're just saying when rent is under $1,000, we qualify differently. Maybe we look at lower credit scores. Maybe we accept less employment verification or less income. But it's perfectly legitimate to say we've got a set of qualifying standards for under $1,000 a month, maybe from $1,000 to $2,000, a little tighter set of standards, and then maybe over $2,000, a different set of standards. As long as that's not racially motivated or religious motivated or gender motivated or color motivated, it's perfectly okay. You know, most of us already have 2 sets of guidelines, right? So you might have 2 or 3 or 4 different sets of guidelines. You might have a large investor group that's funded by some kind of REIT or capital group that has a different qualifying guidelines that you have to fit into. So the question is, can you have different qualifying guidelines for different slices of your market? And literally, you can get ridiculous about this because if you have one owner, one house, literally each owner can establish their own guidelines for their property. Now, that would be ridiculous. Nobody's going to do that. Offering that would drive you crazy, wouldn't it? So it's silly to say every owner can, but they could. There's no problem with that. If you got owners under 2 or 5 or 10 houses, the better thing to do is to force them into your standard qualifying guidelines. But each owner literally could do that. The key is to have standard guidelines. So the conclusion looks something like this. Smaller owners must adapt and fit into your qualifying guidelines. Makes perfect sense. If you have a large investor group, or if you have another slice of the market, let's say in your town it might be under $900 a month, might be over $2,500 a month. People in California on the coast where average rent's $4,000 a month, trust me, they use a different set of standards for qualifying those applicants than they do for somebody who's applying for a $1,000 a month rental property. We all have different slices of market, and it's okay to have different qualifying guidelines for each slice of that market, as long as you're applying the standards consistently all the time to all applicants who fall into that category. Now, as long as you approve. So here's what the requirements really are. Let's bring it down to a conclusion. Your standards must be in writing. Why? To get good tenants? No. To prepare for a fair housing claim. Must be in writing. Secondly, you must have them in writing for each category. So literally, if you have qualifying guidelines for over $2,000 a month, that's going to be for this set of applicants, and have another one. They must be in writing. They must be applied consistently to all applicants in that category. Next, you must drive for objectivity, right? You're not talking to them on the phone, getting friendly, going out for a lunch. You're not trying to get comfortable with them. You don't want to violate the rules of HUD for who you cannot discriminate against, but you certainly can discriminate by amount of rent they can pay, can't you? Sure. Okay? And it's not based on any of the fair housing categories. So let's look at some of the warnings and cautions, okay? 1, don't let small owners modify your guidelines. It's crazy to let an owner say, I don't want to let anybody in my house for under 800 credit score. I've got an 850 credit score. I think everybody should. But that's dangerous because now you're being very selective with a particular owner, and that'll drive you crazy. Property management is a nickel-dime business. You must have volume. And the volume means you must have systems for speed and efficiency. So having a set of guidelines for each owner is crazy. Wouldn't make any sense. Large investors can create their own guidelines as long as you agree with them and they're fitting and following Fair Credit Reporting Act, American with Disabilities Act, Service Members Relief Act, all the different laws that govern our business. So let's look at qualifying guidelines, and finally, they are not intended to identify good applicants. That is not why you need qualifying guidelines. They are not required to comply with any law. There's no law that I know of that says you must have qualifying guidelines in writing and apply them consistently. If there is, tell me about it. I've been at this 35 years. I've never seen one. They also are not required by any association or code of ethics. This is not a matter of to comply with the law, you must. No. Here's what qualifying guidelines are for. Number 1, they're designed to help you avoid using the wrong criteria for approving and denying applicants. Okay? They're just there as guardrails to make sure you do it just right. But there's a second reason that you want to have qualifying guidelines, and that is they're designed to prepare your defense when you're charged with a fair housing claim. You know, guidelines are critical, but they're most critical when somebody charges you with a fair housing violation. Because now you can sit down and show your guidelines and how you apply them consistently across the board by category, okay? So the myth, of course, myth number 2 is a professional manager must apply their qualifying guidelines to every applicant the same way every time, right? No, that's actually wrong. Now you can find an awful lot about qualifying guidelines on our site, trainingpropertymanagers.com under resources, there's a whole section on qualifying guidelines. We've screwed this up for 35 years. There's no reason that you should learn from your own mistakes when you can pay a few bucks and learn from ours. We've not only got the Fair Credit Reporting Act, but we've got one with notes in it, training notes. We've got our qualifying guidelines that have evolved within Crown for 35 years. You can, and along with that, I've put in instructor notes. It's a 30-page document. So you take those instructor notes and you review them and you work down to your own set of qualifying guidelines for each slice of the market that you're engaged in. Well, I hope that's been helpful to you. Thank you for taking the time today to go through this with us.